Okay, so thank you so much for joining me. I just wanted to ask you about climate change and gender equality. And I wanted to ask you, how does harassment and assault on women increase due to climate change?
So there's a number of different ways that these two issues are connected, and I think one of the things to say is it's almost impossible to talk about women and climate change without referencing the other aspects of sort of intersectional vulnerabilities like poverty and race. So and cultural issues, which mean that in many countries, women have very limited access to political voice, to safety, um, to education and things that could otherwise protect them. But if we look specifically at how climate change interacts with that, we know from studies, both in the US and in Europe and around the world, that heat particularly increases the risk of violent assault, and that includes sexual assault. So the increase in heat waves that we're seeing can lead to increased sort of gender and sexualized based violence against women. Extreme weather events, again, we know from research, also increases the risk of both domestic violence and violence outside of the home towards women, and also to increase in trafficking. So, during extreme weather events, women are often much more vulnerable, particularly in poorer nations, where they're perhaps less likely to swim. They may have restrictive clothing. They're less likely to have a mobile phone. They'd be relying on men to relay sort of early warning systems, which sometimes they don't have the education to understand the scientific language, which puts them more at risk. They're also more likely to be inside the home, and in the most extreme cases, they're not allowed to leave the home without a male relative with them. So that can really put them in a very dangerous situation during sort of extreme weather events like storms and floods and wildfires.
Just there, when you were talking about heat, are women more likely to be attacked because the climate is hot or because there's a sudden heat wave in that area?
Because of a change in temperature. So a heat wave really is that's an increase above what you would expect as the normal temperatures. So it's not the case that women are more likely to be attacked in hot countries. It's when you have a heat wave, what you can see is an increase in levels of violent crime to a certain point. Beyond a certain point, everybody's too hot to do anything.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no. So as I say, in all sorts of different cultures, this has been shown that a sudden increase does have that impact. Of course, the other thing to bear in mind is prolonged heat and reduction in rainfall, leading to sort of prolonged drought, particularly in developing nations where women are responsible for fetching water, fetching firewood. They're having to walk further. Um, and that's putting them again at increased risk of sexual assault whilst they're out. There was a recent study by Plan working with adolescent girls in South Sudan, and about 26% of those young girls had seriously considered suicide in the last month, and that was primarily due to a sort of combination of factors, one of which was their risk of being sexually assaulted when they were out, but also being pulled out of education because they were having to look after younger siblings, because there was an increased workload because of the stress of drought on actually being able to sort of feed the family, get enough water, etc.
Um, I'm genuinely really, really shocked by all of this information. I feel like a little bit overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you really look at these issues, um, and face up to the reality of what's happening in the world. I think it's easy for people living in England to think of climate change as something that's kind of distant in the future, but for particularly for women in the global south, this is a reality. It's now. 40 to 80% of food in the global south is grown by women smallholders. So the change in climate, the change in increased drought, different weather patterns, they don't know when the rains are coming. That's making life for women who are already working really hard to support and feed their families. It's making life so much harder for them. Um, on top of the fact that in many of these communities, the men are having to leave because their way of life is changing. They're not able to sustain their ancestral way of life anymore. So they're left behind, trying to cope, trying to manage. And about 80% of the people that we would think of as climate refugees, although that's still not internationally a legal term, are women. And you think about, for a woman who's been brought up in a place where the way of life hasn't changed maybe for hundreds of years, to suddenly be displaced away from all of those social networks that they would rely on and that would support them, away from any kind of sense of security. And often in refugee camps, the needs of women aren't really cared for. So even in the developed world, so after Hurricane Katrina, more than half of the poor families that were displaced were headed by single mothers. And in the shelters that they were put in, there was no access to sanitary products. So, you imagine having gone through that traumatic experience, you've lost your support network, you're in some kind of school hall on a camp bed surrounded by a bunch of strangers, and you've got your period with no sanitary products, no access to laundry. So it's all of these different risks are really piling up for these women. And when you kind of think about that and think about the fact that 1% of the human population, this is from an Oxfam report, the richest 1% are responsible for twice the emissions of the rest, 50% of the rest of the human population, and they're the ones that are suffering now. And so that's, that comes back to, this is our lifestyles that are causing this, but we're not even seeing those impacts. We're not hearing those voices. But I think, what we need to do with that is not kind of sink under a weight of kind of guilt and shame and despair about it. We've got to use that to motivate ourselves to do something about it. Because if we allow ourselves to sink, then it doesn't get better. Those negative emotional states are there to motivate us to do something, to recognize that there's a threat. And, whilst we're talking about the fact that women are disproportionately the victims here, we're not just passive victims. There are some incredible women around the world doing some absolutely extraordinary work to address these issues. And what we know is that where women are more involved in, so governments with more women representatives are more likely to enact environmental and climate change policies. We've got some incredible politicians. We've got our own Caroline Lucas in this country, is just awesome, and Greta Thunberg, but also, huge numbers of BIPOC women from around the world. So Radhimi Pandey, who was just 9 years old when she filed a lawsuit against the Indian government for failing to take action on climate change. In this country, we've got Rosamund Kissy-Debrah, awesome woman who's taken her grief from the loss of her daughter Ella, and set up this foundation to work to highlight the issue of air pollution and inadequate care for people with asthma. Got Berta Caceres in Honduras, who was a female environmental activist who lost her life in the course of her work. Wangari Maathai, who was the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He set up the Green Belt movement. Madonna Bravebull Allard, who started the Dakota Access Pipeline protest that ended up involving 300 tribal nations and like 2,000 indigenous protesters from around the world. And those women were, they were peacefully protesting, and they were met with really violent responses from the government and from private security firms, in freezing cold temperatures, attack dogs, water cannons. These women are absolutely the definition of awesome. There's just so many just amazing female role models: Naomi Klein, Kate Rayworth, Rachel Carson. Many people don't know that Eunice Foote, back in 1850s, was the first scientist to actually identify the greenhouse gas effect 3 years before Tyndall. But of course, nobody took that up because she was a woman. I have to say, one of my personal heroes, Canary Webb, if you don't know about the Health in Harmony project, is just the most beautiful thing. Her compassion and humility in working with Indigenous communities is just fantastic. And at the moment they're fundraising because they started in Borneo, they're now working in Madagascar, which, as we know, has been hit by a climate-induced famine, and also recently by a series of typhoons. So yeah, watch her, Kinari Webb, watch her TED talk. It's just amazing. So, women have a huge amount to offer to this whole movement. So whilst it's really important to recognize how we're more vulnerable, we're also powerful.
We did touch a little bit before on the vulnerabilities that women are left open to due to flash floods, natural disasters, and I just wanted to look more specifically at the kind of vulnerabilities that women are left open to when they're in temporary housing or they're in temporary accommodation, because me and Catherine Kennett spoke a little bit about it on the podcast, and she said that these camps, these temporary housing areas, aren't made for women, and they are, as in when they're planned out, they're not made with women in mind. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
As I've mentioned, the lack of sort of support for menstruation and sanitary products being available is one thing. Again, there are issues around access to toilets where they can be private, to washing facilities, and also kind of taking into account their sort of cultural needs as well, particularly where they've come from cultures where they should have, a male relative with them. If they're going out, they need certain types of clothing. So it's bearing that in mind as well. I also wanted to touch on reproductive health, because obviously, that's a really big issue for women. We're the ones who bring new people into the world. And obviously when people are pregnant, they're more vulnerable. So we mentioned earlier heat, so pregnant women are less able to regulate their body temperature, so they're more at risk during heat waves. And we know that heat waves also impact on the baby as well, so they're more likely to deliver early, to be low birth weight. And also, again, air pollution also impacts pregnancy outcomes. So people who are exposed to high levels of air pollution during pregnancy, again, more likely to deliver early, to have low birth weight babies. And it's also been associated with jaundice and anemia in the babies. And that's then, that has cascading effects, because those kids are more likely to develop learning and developmental disorders, which then puts more strain on the family. So there's lots of different ways in which women are more vulnerable when they're pregnant, and obviously also nutrition's incredibly important, and also with things like mosquito-borne disease, which we know is increasing because of climate change. So women who, as I say, in the developing world, they're smallholders, they're more, they're going out to collect water, they're more likely to be infected with things like malaria. And of course, 2015, we had Zika virus, where, in South America, countries were saying to women, don't get pregnant. This is in, a continent where most women are Catholic and don't have access to family planning. So, there's lots of issues around reproductive health and also women's rights within that. So, again, kind of looking from a solutions side, the Project Drawdown, which looked at, various, about 80 to 100 different solutions globally. In their top 10, two of those solutions are educating women and giving women access to family planning. So this is not about, people telling people not to have children. This is about women having the dignity and the right to make that choice. And what we know is that when women are educated, when they have access to family planning, they have smaller families and their children are more healthy, their families are more resilient. So, if we kind of think about, well, how can we be helpful? Well, if we support organisations which are promoting education for women, the project in South Sudan that I mentioned earlier, in South Sudan, less than 15%, 16% of girls over the age of 15 can even read and write. And yet, when we think, okay, so those women in the global south are the ones who are feeding their families. They're growing most of the food. If those women had access to land rights, if they had access to credit, if they had the education that would allow them to make those adaptations to the changes that climate change is bringing, then they could, you know, they could feed their families better, they could raise their income, they could bring themselves out of poverty. So, you know, education, access to family planning is huge globally in terms of not only women's well-being and their quality of life, but also kind of as a side benefit, incredibly powerful in terms of you know, preventing the climate crisis getting worse than it is.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today. I don't want to take up any more of your time, but it's been very illuminating and a little bit, well, quite saddening as well.
Well, yes, it's good. It's appropriate to be sad, but we've got to do something with it. You know, I think, you know, one of the things I love about Christiana Figueres is she's come up with some brilliant quotes, and one of them is, you know, hope is not soft. Hope is the axe you break the door down with in an emergency. That's what we've got to be doing. We've got to be maintaining hope and maintaining a vision of a world where we have gender equality, where we have social equality, and where we also live a sustainable lifestyle which, you know, allows well-being for everybody. And it's possible. We know how to do it. We've just got to create the political will.
Thank you so much.